since it's not a unlimited call. So I think, am I recording now? Yes, I am recording. Okay.
Yes.
So I guess now would be a good time. We can jump into it, and if anybody joins, hopefully the context isn't too jarring for them. But so the idea here, I've pulled up this issue. For anybody who doesn't have the background, I think most people do, but Gutenberg is not a TypeScript project as far as the code itself is not written in TypeScript. But as time has gone on and as features of TypeScript have improved as far as doing type checking of JavaScript code, we wanted to opt into that to try to give some more confidence in the code that we write as far as sort of the correctness and how we use types. And it also holds us more accountable. We were already using, so the way that this works is it tries to use the JSDoc documentation, which, you know, when you write JSDoc, you give it a type for the parameters of the return type. And we were already doing that. And so the thinking was, you know, just take advantage or try to leverage what we were already doing in a way that can benefit us, to tell us when we're using values wrong, passing values around incorrectly. And also, I think it should also help to make sure that those documentation are accurate, because what I think I've found over time is that you could look at a JS doc and there was nothing to ever actually verify that it was correct. And so a lot of times you would find that it's not correct. So now that we have tooling in place that can use that documentation, it gives us confidence not only that the documentation is correct, but also using it to sort of have some of the benefits of TypeScript while not actually going all the way to using the TypeScript language. And, you know, in the future, you know, we can always have these discussions again as far as whether TypeScript makes sense for the project. It's been discussed several times at this point. I think the issue has some context, some background as far as like those decisions, if you were really interested. So the issue here is 18838 in Gutenberg. But for the purposes of this call, I just wanted to jump into a module and see if we can try to get it type checked, get the code actually running, check off one of these items here. So I guess one of the challenges we've run into is like, we want to add type checking, but all of these modules depend on a lot of the other modules. And so it's kind of this chicken and egg problem where we need to, I think, John, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but like the idea would be that we need to kind of target some of what you might call like leaf packages, sort of the packages that don't really depend on other packages, but are dependencies of other packages. And that's why you see a lot of these are kind of those like leaf type packages, which can be beneficial as well because they tend to be kind of smaller, focused, maybe simpler to type. So like, you know, if you get into this sooner, you might be able to pick off some of these low-hanging fruits that might not actually be too difficult to add types for. It's just, you know, you sort of balance it with like, is there value with adding types to the hooks package that we don't really even want to be using anymore? So I don't know if anybody had one in mind or sees one here that they think could be good. So with that context, I'm sort of saying let's avoid things like block editor, although block editor is interesting because, you know, this will be a challenge as far as adding types for really big packages that you can't just open a pull request that says add types for block editor because it's a massive module that will take a lot of work. And so there was an approach here that I might actually, I'll show it at least, but it's something we could do in a demo, which is rather than enabling type checking for the entire module, to pick individual files within that that can easily be type checked. So there was a file here, dom.js, that I don't think really had any dependencies I don't think there were any dependencies in this file. And so it was not really too hard to add type checking for that file. And so the thinking here is that in order to sort of tackle this challenge of how do you add types for a massive module, what we could do is, and I left a document, a little comment here explaining, which is just pick individual files and kind of gradually add type checking for a module. And then at some point, you say that that module is done, and done meaning you now start to ship the type definitions for that package, because we don't do that here because it's not totally type checked. So I think that that's another option as far as if you want to approach type checking. You don't have to, it's not like all or nothing necessarily. You don't have to have the entire package type checked. What you will find is that it really depends if the code you want to add type checking for has dependencies on other packages that we write. And kind of going back to that leaf package idea, you know, a lot of our code depends on a lot of our other code. So yes, you will run into that quite a bit. Riyadh, yeah, the DOM module, that was the one that I actually looked at. And because I think if I recall correctly, the DOM module is a pretty good candidate as far as like, you know, it's a lot of these generic utility functions that where the input parameters and the output values are pretty well determined or pretty well understood as far as what their types are. And we can use a lot of, I guess, the global types, the DOM types that are naturally available to us. I don't know, John, you might know how those get to us better. TypeScript, you know, obviously has, you know, these base types, but then once you get into things like the DOM, like the DOM is not necessarily a built-in. I think it's shipped as a library, right, John? Is that like a default library?
Yeah, that depends on how you configure TypeScript for your particular build. I think they call them, I think it's under the lib configuration. So depending on how you set up your target and the lib configuration, you'll get DOM, or you might get the script host, or they have those like kind of base types split up in different ways.
Sorry, I'm missing the participants window. I saw Elizabeth was meeting. Hi, Elizabeth, sorry for the, it's really hard to see the participant window to see somebody's in the waiting room that Zoom has, so welcome. Yeah, so so that was my understanding, is there's sort of a core set of libraries if you wanted to opt into, and so something like DOM would be a pretty common one for a lot of projects. So yeah, let's try to add types for this DOM package here. We can follow the documentation, which would be good for if you ever are trying to do this yourself. There is documentation to be found under the packages folder. I think it's at the very bottom, TypeScript, which describes, you know, how the project uses TypeScript and then what to do to be able to add TypeScript type checking for a specific package. So it's really not too bad as far as like actually adding type checking. And typically what I'll do is just steal a tsconfig file, which is how TypeScript knows that you want to, it's like the configuration file for TypeScript. So, you know, if there's a tsconfig file somewhere for a package that already exists, you know, it's a good place to start. Just take it, because a lot of this is going to apply for all of our packages. So we have a base configuration which just describes some of the defaults that we want to use for TypeScript. If you're interested, you could look, but for the most part, you sort of treat it as that's our default configuration. And then a few options here. Source is obviously where all of the source code is, and then for the output of the types, we need to define the declaration directory. The one gotcha that I think people will run into here is this references property. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of a duplication of like a package JSON. So for example, the accessibility package has a dependency on the DOM ready package. And that's defined in package JSON. And that's what we have to do here is define it as a reference. And this comes as a result of how the project is configured in TypeScript as the term is composite project is how it's set up, which is kind of aligns to how we structure Gutenberg as a mono repository. John, you've unmuted, so I don't know if you have things to add. If you already unmuted.
That sounded perfect.
Great. So this will be the one thing that might trip you up. Any packages that you depend on, or at least are depended upon as part of the files that are being type checked, will need to be included here. But it's you know, it follows the same pattern. You have an object that has path to a relative path, and that should be it for any package you're using. So, you know, I can copy this. Yeah, copy this. We're looking at the DOM. Sorry, everything's open. I guess I should clarify that, you know, if you're using VS Code already, a lot of the integrations will be just there. It'll just work. I believe it should just work. I'll talk about, you know, hiccups once we get to them. But it's mostly straightforward. I don't know other editors. You might find a plugin for TypeScript that adds integration. I just don't really, I'm not familiar with other editors, so I can't really advise people on that. But so I've copied this. You know, DOM ready isn't necessarily a dependency here. It might be, but I guess, you know, the next step might be to see what the dependencies are. So there's no dependencies on other WordPress projects here, which is a good thing. As far as this is a leaf package, we don't have to worry about that. Would have been one of the things that could have prevented us from adding types here, is if we depended on another package that wasn't already typed. So this is a good candidate. Everything else here is fine. You know, the root directory is source. I don't know why is it saying here? Oh, I think it's fine. Yeah, this is good. Eventually, once we get to the point of doing a pull request, this build types will be the output directory. So, and I think this is all included in the documentation, but we'll need to include an entry in the package JSON that instructs a consumer of this package where TypeScript can find those type definitions. And then the last thing that we'll need to do in order to have the type checking enabled for the entire project is there's a TS config at the root of the project. And this basically says, okay, what of our packages are opted into type checking? And this corresponds to when you run npm run. When you run npm run build package types, it will reference this file here. So if you don't include that package here, it won't be type checked. Oh, I have the Riyadh. I haven't run an npm install since last time. So I'll add DOM here. And that should be it as far as now TypeScript will run type checking on this package. That's the one stage one. And now it's fixing all of the issues that TypeScript will inevitably find with that package, because like I said, we have JS doc in a lot of cases, but you will find in the course of doing this that it's not always accurate, and TypeScript will hold you accountable for making sure that it's accurate. The other thing to note is that by default, with that default configuration that I was telling you about, it's pretty strict by default as far as kind of wanting you to do things the right way. there's a few of those options that you will run into quite often. I think the one that you probably will be the most common is called no implicit any, which I'll struggle to explain what basically I think the way that it works is that if TypeScript's not able to infer the type, it will kind of fall back to treating it as the any type, which is kind of basically the equivalent of not being typed, which, you know, in some cases, if you're just trying to be quick about your work and just get it done, like, you might be okay with that, but you're also just basically saying, I don't care what this, I don't care to have type checking here, which defeats the purpose to an extent. So that's why it's strict by default. Some of our packages, just to sort of get it over the finish line, opted out of that. But ideally, you start from that position of letting it be strict and fixing the issues. But if it becomes too overwhelming, that's always an option. So I ran the commands. You see there's a ton of issues here, a ton of issues. So, you know, you could, and I'll come back to this. I'll come back to this and we'll run through probably each individual issue. But I also just want to show the editor integration, which is kind of neat as well. So if I go to this first one, DOM source DOM, on line 31, there should be an error. Okay, so it's already here. Well, one thing you will find sometimes is that if you add type checking for a package, it might not, like, the editor might need to, it's like cached and it doesn't know that it's supposed to be doing the type checking. So you might need to tell it to, hey, now there's type checking enabled. You might not see anything here. The two ways that I find work well in order of increasing severity is there in VS Code. If you do Command Shift P, it brings up all of the various commands you can use, and there's one called JavaScript Reload Project, and I find that this works pretty well to say, hey, there's a new TypeScript configuration, or that TypeScript configuration has been changed, and sort of reloading the editor integration. The next most severe is to quit VS Code entirely and then reopen it. You know, that's kind of the explosive option. So yeah, found an issue here. Let's see what the issue is. Object is possibly null. So let's see. We know that selection is a selection type, and that anchor can be. So right here, we very well may have found a potential error, which is that anchor node might not actually be set on the selection object. We might not actually ever encounter it in most cases because, like, I don't know, there's probably conditions that check to see that the selection is a candidate for anchor node having been set here. But if it's not, this is going to blow up in the editor and cause an error, and the whole editor is going to crash. And that's the first thing we've just run into here. So, you know, we're not dealing well with this scenario that anchor node is null. In this case, what we might want to do, it depends on, like, what the function is selection forward. Maybe if anchor node isn't assigned on the selection that's passed, a smart default might just be to say that the return value should be false, like if we're returning a Boolean. I don't know. If anybody has other thoughts, that's just my instinct. I don't know. Depends what the anchor node. And you'll see, you know, now that I'm dealing with that scenario, TypeScript is pretty smart about knowing that has been accommodated, so that by the point that it reaches, and you can even see in the tooltip here that it now knows that it is a node for sure, because it would have already short-circuited if it was null. So similarly, I guess focus node can be null. You know, so if not focus node, and you know, we're going through and individually fixing all of the errors here. So that's kind of the general process to add type checking for a module is, you get the configuration in place, you run the command to do the type checking. And if you're lucky, there might be few to no issues. If you're not lucky, you might have to kind of go through this somewhat tedious process to think about like, okay, well, if anchor node is null or if focus node is null, what should we be doing? And I think I would argue that that's a good thing.
Andrew, I have a question.
Oh yeah.
And
yeah, sure.
Feel free to skip over this because I don't want to throw a wrench into your thing. So in the case of anchor node, how, now that we're starting to use more ES for ES future kind of features like optional chaining, how would that work with TypeScript checking? Because
that might have been an option actually. Now that you mention it, is to like, okay, this is null, right? So if we use that optional chaining operator, it will work. I guess in this case now position could be number or undefined, and then now this is going to fail because this is possibly undefined. So like all of this, I don't know, if to me this is like exciting to see how this cascading effects. I don't have to think about it. Like, as a developer, a lot of times you're like, oh, you might know what a selection object is, and you might know it has these properties. And, if you really, really know your stuff, you might know that anchor node could be null, but I think a lot of people probably might not. Like, clearly we didn't necessarily anticipate that scenario here, but as humans, we should accept that, we're not going to know all of this stuff and rely on the tools to kind of tell us where those errors are. It's kind of like, I liked more recently, I've been thinking about it. It's almost like how you've come to rely on ESLint or ESLint to kind of tell you like a variable's not used, or like you're referencing a variable that's not assigned, or all those various errors that ESLint will flag for you. It's almost like saying, hey, would you ever want to go back to not having that? It's once you see it and you sort of start to appreciate all of the things that it's highlighting for you, it's hard to want to go back. I mean, obviously, like as you go through this, some of these things are going to be frustrating. I think what you will find, and the position we've put ourselves in, is that by doing this retroactively, like we already have most of this code already done. And now we're saying, okay, we want to add type checking after the fact. It's going to be a naturally more painful process than if we had done this from the start, or sort of written code with TypeScript in mind. We wouldn't do some of the there's certain things, and in the course of like some of the type checking that I've added, some of the things that we've done are clever, and TypeScript doesn't really like some of that cleverness. And you could say, oh, I'm fighting with TypeScript, but I think there's another angle, which is maybe TypeScript has a point and that cleverness was a bad idea and you shouldn't have done that. Or, I don't know. It's trying to go into it and be optimistic about what it's doing for you.
I'm so glad you talked about that, because I think a lot of the talks that I've seen where people have championed typing in TypeScript, where they say, oh, it's so easy to just like start converting files that you already have into TypeScript. I mean, superficially, it's very easy to say that, but when you have a large project, something like Gutenberg, where there are lots of dependencies and lots of decisions have already been made, it's not as easy as advertised. And everything that you're sharing right now, from like the picking which files to even start and describing all the micro kind of decisions that have been made and what you need to make now in order to enable typing in a way that you don't tear your hair out, I think it's incredibly valuable for you to like just share the thought process behind this stuff, because not a lot of blog posts and stuff talk about this.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah,
hard. This is like the hardest part.
it really is. And, I think, you could look at that GitHub issue and be like, oh yeah, just go through one by one and, add typing for annotations, typing for this.
Right.
And that's where you will encounter what you're talking about, which is like, oh, it's not working. And then you just have a bad first impression, and you just it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and you don't want anything to do with it. And I think, we kind of, even our approach in general and how we're using JavaScript, but trying to bring in type checking is sort of a compromise in a sense, and it's not like the pure way of doing it. Sorry, I messed up my Zoom settings. So, there we go. We kind of have to be strategic and make compromises. That's like, I think what I was talking about with the block editor, because it occurred to me, something like block editor, the way that we were going about adding type checking is just like, how would you ever add type checking for a module like block editor? But clearly we want it, and it's important. And so like that approach that I showed at the very beginning, where like you pick individual files to add type checking for, like finding ways to kind of ease into this workflow by finding the candidates that are going to be the easiest. And then as time goes on, as more and more things are typed, it should be, and people gain the familiarity with this process, hopefully some of those pain points become less acute. Yeah, so I can go through some more specific instances here. I'm looking at this and it says selection start doesn't exist on type element, and I believe the issue here is that and a lot of these things, so like for example, if we go look up on oh, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant either. Yeah, so you see here, well, and in fact, this visualization is a great way to show you the problem. We're assuming that we're receiving element. The selection start property is not a member of the element interface, it's a member of the input. So like, and it might seem sort of like a trivial distinction, but like, you're basically saying, I accept any element, and I assume that there's a selection start on that, but that's not every element is going to have selection start. If I did document.body.selection start, it doesn't exist. But if I did, this is an input, I assume, and I did selection start, it does exist. So it's worth, it's an important distinction, because otherwise you're saying, I will accept a body element and be able to operate on it. So really the solution here would be to fix the type element. And now the error goes away. And we probably want to fix all of that. But. So again.
Or maybe the function accepts a generic element, and if it's like an input, it does something, but if it's not an input, it does something else.
Yeah, that's that becomes a little bit tricky to convince, especially in JavaScript, I find, to convince TypeScript that you're working with an object, or change how it considers a variable. So like if this was element and this thinks it's a container is an element, to trick or convince TypeScript that it's actually, like if I wanted to do switch container dot, I don't know, tag name, and I had, it's node name, right? Node name should it have, hold on, is tag name a thing? Why didn't it error? Okay, I guess it's a thing, you know. TypeScript teaches you stuff. I don't know. It is a thing.
Few lines.
Yes.
It's
So, you know,
tag name.
Yeah, and this is, you know, maybe a good example too, is like if I don't know, maybe I hadn't had my coffee for the day and I was convinced that it was container.tag or something, and I do container.tag and case input. You see, it already tells you, you know, tag doesn't exist. Like these are kind of those small in the moment things where you're like, oh, thank you, TypeScript. thank you for, you know, fixing my brain fart that I had in that moment. But to your point now, like even if like at this point I could feel confident that selection start actually exists on a node of this type, TypeScript still thinks container is element. Like, you know, you have to kind of trick it. So in TypeScript or any type language, this is something where you could do type casting. If you wanted to, so let's see, console.log selection start. And it's gonna complain because I'm using console log, but you know, here it still thinks it's a type element, and you know, in a, I don't know, in what is it? You know, in TypeScript it would be something like, you know, HTML input element. Is that the syntax? I think that doesn't work in JavaScript, but we do have something equivalent, which is if you do this syntax, and I think specifically you'll find you have to add these parentheses around the thing that you want to be typecasting. It will now consider that as an whatever it is that you're casting it to. So this does exist. So, you know, you could even say like input, you could even assign this as a variable. And well, you might not even need to do that. You could do, well, you need to do that. Let's find out. Unscripted. Yeah, see, it doesn't like this because it thinks you're trying to assign an element to this variable with type HTML element. And that's why you need this casting syntax. And then it's able to use type inference to understand that this is now an HTML input element, and I can, if I wanted to, use those properties.
It's so funny that you showed this technique, because I've seen and I've personally experienced maybe like 5 different ways of doing typecasting, and I've never seen this one before. And I've seen like various code bases do different things for like, oh, do this as something else, or you start with unknown and use generics or whatever the heck.
Yeah,
it's in a way, it's unfortunately inconsistent there.
Yeah. This, I mean, as far as I have found, this should be almost the equivalent of what I had first shown. If you're familiar with TypeScript, that's right. My understanding. It's, it's a little clunky. It's a little, it's not the nicest thing to look at, but that's the compromise we're making by using type checking in JavaScript. All of this stuff isn't quite as pretty or elegant as it would be if you were using TypeScript itself, because the language has that syntax built in. But anyways, that's a big long tangent, but typecasting is something you will probably need to do. I think okay, so we're at less than a minute now. What I might do, so again, I have a hard stop at the hour. I will restart the meeting. If anybody, I'll drop a link in Core.js. If anybody wants to rejoin, feel free. Otherwise, I won't judge if you need to move on with your day. So I will rejoin you. Okay, so we are now recording again, just sort of chatting about adding types for React props or React components, and how you can use the type checking on the props. And it's actually another reason why we should be doing all of our components as function components, because it works like just, it's a function. It's not anything special. It's a function that where the first argument is an option or an object with certain properties that have types. And unlike a class component where you need to kind of like, you know, I don't even know if it does anything with prop types or understands the props that a class component can use. I'm not even concerned with that. I don't even want to think about that, because every component should just be a function component, and then you don't have to think about it. So, all right, I will share my screen again. Let me make sure I get the. All right. Any questions? I mean, I don't really have, like, again, it's unscripted, so we can kind of go through. I think it's been useful in a lot of ways to sort of see some of these common things that you will encounter. You know, this was a good example of the typecasting to see, like, you will definitely encounter scenarios like this where you're just like, TypeScript, treat this as an input element. Like, what, like, it's not an element. I want it to be treated as something else, and this will be the pattern that you can use for that. Again, input element. I saw down here. This is another. We've run in. I could pull up issues right now on the Gutenberg repository where we have there's crashed application because window.get selection can be null. And we're not dealing with it. We just, selection dot range count. You know, it must be, you know, selection can be null here, and that's an error. It's a real error that we have encountered. So, no, selection. This might be something where optional chaining works. The optional chaining, I get so confused when you do it with negation. Like it just, my brain melts trying to understand how this, because technically this can have two different possible outcomes. It can have selection as nullish, and so it's now evaluated as null and then negated, so this is now true, which I think is what we want here. But it's not always what you want when you're doing. I've brought this up in the core.js chat as far as not allowing the syntax, but it's sometimes the correct way. And here, I think it's the correct way of treating it. So, trying to understand what this is. So yeah, I mean, I could sit there and try to figure out what it is. The general process, again, so I think John had mentioned that there's a lot of errors. This is just this file, I think. So there's, what is that, 72, 73 problems in this file alone, which I guess is probably the biggest file here. It's a pretty big, almost 800 lines long. I mean, you see things like this, and you know, like parent node might not exist, but we assume that it does, and it might be fine for a lot of cases. But that's kind of what we're banking on with TypeScript, is to make it impossible to have an error ever. I guess I'm trying to think. You know, these I sort of showed it a little bit along the way, but you know, just by saying that this variable is type element, one of the best things here is that, assuming you're using VS Code, you get all of the autocomplete for free. Like, look at all, like, do you want to go look up all of these various properties? And like I was saying earlier, is like maybe, you know, I'm trying to access the node name property, and I don't really recall what like how the property is called, and something with node. Oh yeah, that's right, node name returns a string appropriate for the type of node. Like, you know, you get that for free just by the fact that, you know, this is type checked and TypeScript understands this to be of type element, and that works with. I mean, you'd be amazed how deep that goes even when you're operating on, like, you know, if something here was a function that received a parameter, and that parameter was an array of numbers, and you could treat it as an array, do like a for each, and in the for each, it knows that each member is a number. Like it you don't have to, a lot of time, you sort of think, oh, it's so tedious to add the types for these things. And in a lot of cases, you don't actually have to do much. Like TypeScript will infer a lot. And I don't have to sit here and tell TypeScript that parent node is of type node and node or null. Like it knows what it's going to be. A lot of these are similar sorts of what I was telling you about or what we were shown with the input element. Like, I used a pretty, generic type here for element. This name property is off of, what is that element called? Area, the area element, something you probably never use, but there's an area element, and I guess it must have a property name. Right. Oh, so, closest will return element, but this is another scenario where if we're assuming that it will be of a certain type, TypeScript's not that smart that it's going to decipher based off of your query selector here that you're receiving a map element. So you might need to do things like that typecasting. So map, is it map? Is map an element? Area element? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't know what that, I don't know.
Do you ever option click through to see the see the interfaces that TypeScript has defined?
Yes. What is it? Is it control?
Like on the HTML area element, you can option click and it'll open it up. Sometimes I'll go in there and even look for.
Yeah, I do use this a lot, especially when you're working with like React types, for example. And there was a discussion we had in the Core.js chat about whether we wanted to recreate all these types that React has. And then once you get into this file, the equivalent of this file for this type definition file for React, you start to realize, oh wow, there's a lot here. It's all very useful. Like all of these, you can see all of the properties, I guess even comments here, because this will feed into the tooltip that comes up. You can see the tooltip there uses that, sets or retrieves, if you wanted to know what that property was about. So I guess here I might figure out what has map or name, right? Name. What is this? Button element. I don't. I'm looking over here. Embed, field set. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of an advanced case where like, how many times have I ever used a map element? I don't really familiar with it, but in a lot of cases, you'll be more familiar with, the type of element that you're working with. Oh, there, is that? That's it. Why didn't that come up though? Because I was typing HTML map. So there. I swear I typed that and it said it didn't exist, but that fixed it because now it understands that that exists. Yeah, hopefully that gives some I'm trying to think what other common gotchas you might run into.
I think type def, if you have an
Type
example
def
of
would be
type
good.
def.
Yeah. Let's see. Just a good example here. Yeah. So, so that file we were just looking at is a type. Oh, I guess it's already gone. But that file with all of the interfaces is a type definition file, and it sort of defines the various interfaces that allow you to reference an HTML map element. Now, obviously, there's all of the core types, but then we might want to define our own types. And there's a few reasons you might do this. For example, object, if you're passing around an object, or even defining, like an option for defining the props of a component could be to say, foo component or type def foo component props or something. And then you could go through here and say, is active, or Boolean, is the component active. And then this has now defined a custom type, which then if you had foo component, which received is active, and you say, I think in this case, you would say it's of, actually, no, the param so this first parameter, I've destructured, I've used object destructuring here, but this is an object, so you can call it props. But that is of type this, and now it understands the properties, so that when I can now treat this as that value, that type that I'm expecting, Boolean. Yeah, div class. You could do whatever you want. I don't know. Class name. No. Doesn't want null and wants undefined. So there's a few examples here. This is creating a tuple, like an array of two members, where each member is a string. Another tuple. I mean, I guess, I don't know, it's specific in this case, probably for how it was implemented. You might not use tuples too much, but that's the syntax if you did want to use it. See, what's another, do you have a certain type def that you can think of? You made some type defs recently, Riyadh.
Yes, for the performance, CLI command.
I guess, in most cases, you would use it, or in a lot of cases, you'll use it to define sort of an object shape. Because you'll find that, I guess that's another gotcha that you'll find, is that objects are kind of hard to type, or at least like if you were to naively say, and you'll see this all over the place, param object, well, that's not a good example. Like, object is everywhere, and it's pretty much worthless. Here's a good example. Like in a state reducer, like this would be a really good candidate to just to detail what it is that object is. You can see here that I guess it's probably a string to. And this is where the lack of typing starts to be like, oh, you miss all of the, like, what is that thing? There's no documentation, there's no description, there's no type here. That's this any type is sort of the, I don't know what it is. TypeScript can't figure it out, so it'll just say any. But in this case, I think it would be really nice if we said like we had a custom type def that was, you know, type def themes state, and if we knew what the properties were, in this case, I guess, you know, it's sort of a variable set of properties. It's not a well-defined. So this would be, we wouldn't document the properties. We would assign it as a type. I guess record is the type. You know, I think we use, this is something I'm still figuring out, but in practice, anywhere we're using object, we probably want to be using record and treating it as a generic, where the, you know, the key type, which will always be string, I guess, and then the value type. So, you know, maybe this is a string. Maybe it's a string. I don't know. I don't actually know. And now, instead of saying object, we know that this is of type theme state, which might actually tell us, well, this file isn't type checked. Oh, here's another good hint. It doesn't always work, and I'm pretty sure it just ignores all of our configuration, or it might not do things well. But if you just wanted to like you didn't want to go through the effort of enabling type checking for a package, but you wanted to like take advantage of it, make sure that you're doing correct work. This can also be useful to like get a file ready to be opted into type checking, because like you can be better aware of any potential issues. You can just throw this directive at the top of the file, and now TypeScript will be enabled for that file, or it should be. Yeah, so it's checking some stuff down here. Yeah, but it's still not able to, let's see, I'm surprised it's not able to figure that out.
The action is still an object.
Yeah, the action is still an object. So that, you know, that would be something where like you might want a, you know, themes state action, I guess, or, you know, themes reducer action. And you would document, you know, current theme as a string. And then now you have this custom type. You say, I'm expecting, it needs type, obviously. Every action has a type, action type. Oh, well, there you go. TypeScript helped me understand a little bit better what current theme actually is, because it's not a string, it's an object with a style sheet property. And maybe this is another, so maybe I want, you know, a theme object, theme type that has property style sheet. Type def. Style sheet. And now we're starting to kind of build up this understanding, and we know that this isn't a string anymore. This is a theme. Things falling into place here. Oh.
The action.
There you go. Yeah, so, and you're getting, everything's filling out. You got your type, you got your, even the description of that property is pulled from here. And yeah, and this way, like, you know, it doesn't seem like right away that you're getting this benefit, but like if somebody in the future wanted to add, you know, case delete current theme, and now their task is to remove a theme by the style sheet name or something, you know, you now get all of this benefit. Like, you know, I just typed action dot and okay, it knows there's a current theme, and it knows that current theme has a style sheet property, and, you know, you can take advantage of all of that and you know, it made my life so much easier. You know, yeah, somebody had to do this upfront work, but it paid off. And you know, the idea is to try to find the best balance of the upfront effort versus kind of the long-term payoff. Like we want to try to get the most benefit out of this as possible and avoid errors. I think there's a good case to be made as well that a lot of our unit tests, and especially for some of the state unit tests or select, like some of these unit tests are of actions. Actions is a good one. Action unit tests are not super useful. I don't know, like it's just, yeah, I don't know. I don't find, unless the action's doing a whole lot, which in most cases they're not, they're just like returning an object, then it's like, is it really worth that? Versus like, if we had just added type checking here, like it would be a similar, if not higher, confidence for me in the correctness of this code than to write a unit test, which basically just re-implements the underlying implementation. So it's things like that where, you know, this is supposed to be complementary, and it's just another tool in our toolkit as far as how we have confidence in our code and how we test our code. That can, in some cases, replace the need for a unit test, I would say.
Some of the typing in the data packages can be really very powerful. The way you can link actions and reducers and selectors. You can link all of those things together and get a really high level of confidence that everything is working properly. And then when you're using them, you can get a lot of inference and a lot of information out of it. Just as you type a selector, it'll pull the types of data you're expecting to get out of the types. It's really, really impressive to see.
Yeah, I'm a little bit curious to see, especially the data module in particular, how it develops, because there's so much opportunity there, like you were saying. And today we do benefit, I think, from the third party definitely types have like all of the selectors and actions, as far as I understand. I don't even know how we'll do that in JavaScript. And there might be cases, and I think that's an option we have. If we need to, we can escape out of, I don't know, we don't have any example here, and I'm not even going to show it, but like there are options to escape out of JavaScript land and actually just use some TypeScript or add type definitions if we needed to for things like that. Let's see, there's a couple. I just realized I was looking at participants. Luckily, nobody was trying to knock on the door. Talking about the element type. Yeah. You know, I should clarify, like, object and array are not very useful types, but again, it comes to this question of, like, you know, how much level of effort and correctness, and it'll be an evolving thing. So like array, what I was saying with array not being super useful, you can see it understands it's an array of any, and as you will find out, the any type is sort of the bad guy. You don't want to see the any type very much, because it's basically as if there's no type detail at all, which defeats the purpose. But you know, you could do simple things, I think. I guess it doesn't. Oh, yeah. So, you know, it knows it's an array, so you know, you get some benefit out of it. Ideally, what you would want this to be is, well, ideally you would have some, I don't know, is like, that's the other thing is, like, as a developer, I'm looking at this. I don't know what the heck an entity is. I don't know what that is. Like, well, actually, I do know what it is. But as far as like what properties exist on it, and what we showed earlier, where you could like control click through. Let me see if I can find an example. What? Transform. No. Isn't that okay? You know, if I didn't know what it was, I could, I'm holding Command key right now, I think. I could click through and look at all of this stuff. And if it was better, they would have documentation and stuff here. They don't have any documentation, but that's GitHub's package. But you know, I could see all the things here. I wish I had that. Where was I? Actions. I wish I had that here so I could click through to see what an entity was. I wish this was like entity, you know, array of entities. So this is the syntax. There's a couple syntaxes you might see. So like array and treating it as a generic. This works as well. Yeah, thanks, Marcus. See you. One of the other things maybe I should point out here is that if entity, there is the idea of scope and almost like a variable scope in JavaScript, and there are some like global-ish type. You know, you have your base types like string, and this is what we were talking about way early in the first call about like how does TypeScript become aware of a thing called element, like all the DOM types. Those are sort of injected into the system. But you know, if I'm thinking of entity here, the type as a variable, almost like think of it that way, it needs to be brought into scope. And that's another thing, convention that you'll start to see. TypeScript supports importing in like this. It's not part of the JS doc, but TypeScript adds this as an extension. So if entity isn't a thing in this file, but it is defined as a type def in another file, so like maybe it was, I don't know, in a file relative here called types.js, and in that file you would find the type def, you could do this syntax. And if you wanted to, one of the things you might see is almost treating it like an import by creating an alias within the file itself, which isn't anything special here. It's you know, it is like creating a type def where the type is the type of from that other file. But the advantage here is that you've now kind of like created a simplified name for it, so you could just reference it. I don't know where it was. Array. Yeah, you don't have to have that import because that gets pretty verbose after a while. There are some drawbacks to this that you probably won't encounter too frequently, but things like if entity had a generic, like if it was a generic type, you lose all of that genericness through this, I believe. I mean, it's really more of the advanced use cases. You won't encounter that too much, but this is a nice convenience I've found. And it's nice to almost think of it like an import, like just like you're importing receive items from this file, you're importing entity from this file. Okay. I did say I had to stop at the hour. It's kind of a soft stop, I guess, but is there any other questions? I think, you know, I've gone through a lot, hopefully not too overwhelming for an introduction, probably is, but you know, I think these are common things that you might encounter in the process of doing this, but yeah, any questions? I might do something. Yeah, go ahead.
Someone starting, I find I always found these like type def blocks at the top of files, like a bit dotting, like I don't know. That's my main concern when opening files with a lot of types. It hurts readability a little bit. What do you think about that? And
Um, so, there's some examples, yeah, well, this one, we added all that junk, but I don't know if I have some in my own side projects, certainly, where like the first 100 lines are just type def blocks. I'm not too worried about it. I don't know. It doesn't seem too concerning to me. I guess there is an option if you really wanted to, just like I was kind of faking about there being a types.js file. Like, I don't know. It might be something we could just create a file whose whole purpose is to have these type defs in them if we wanted to. That is an option.
Yeah, that's a cool thing that you mentioned that, because I was thinking how this connects with the world of auto-generating the API docs, and also how a package will export the type definitions it uses, so other packages can use them. Can you talk a bit like that? Like, for example, if we want to use the type defs of this package in block editor, how do we do that? With the import thing you just shown?
Yeah, and in fact, we have some examples, I believe. Well, there's some documentation. I should have mentioned this. There's a whole section of documentation about JavaScript documentation with JSDoc that talks about custom types. There's a lot of information here. It's easy to sort of miss and skim over some of it, but it should be a good reference point for people. But yeah, is this actually, okay, so this isn't, we have a lot of things where, like, I think we're assuming that it'll be available at certain properties, but this isn't actually doing type checking as far as I know. What would one be? Yeah, oh, my trackpad just died, but my understanding, and at first I kind of wanted it to be like you would have an entry point which would do a similar thing where you, my whole Bluetooth system died, an entry point that does a similar thing where it's importing type defs and bringing them into scope, and so that's how it understands it. I think what it ends up being for when TypeScript generates the type definitions for these packages, it just follows the imports. If I understand correctly, it just follows the imports, and any type it discovers throughout that whole cascade of imports, which should be the entire set of types for the entire package, will now be sort of available within the namespace of that package. So basically, any type that exists anywhere in this package, type definition, should be accessible by, importing it as if there was that WordPress module, and then dot, and then whatever the name of the type is. Whether we want that or not, I used to be kind of opinionated about it. Now I think, whatever. If all of the types are available, I don't necessarily see it as a concern. Just like, if you have the React types, you might open it up and there's a whole bunch of internal types that nobody's really supposed to be using directly.
A lot of the time, the types just tend to come along with the functionality that you're using. So when you're using a function, the function has a type, and it's just kind of transparent that its types are there and doing their thing, and you're not actually worried about manually getting the type of that function and using it. It just comes through the system.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, there might be cases where you do want to reference a type directly, but that's one of the really nice things about this upfront work that we're doing, is that once these types are in place, you don't even have to really think about it too much. When you're doing an import, it knows what that type, I'm importing select from WordPress data, and look at all of this, it knows everything, and this is sort of the advantage, the big benefit of doing this work for third-party developers, is that if a third-party developer now imports something from one of the WordPress packages, they get all of this stuff for free. Whether or not they're, in a lot of cases, if they're using VS Code, whether or not they're actually using TypeScript in their own project, it will still understand all of that detail. Okay, I think I might stop there. I hope that was helpful. I think it helped me even to kind of again, this is unscripted, so like I have a better understanding now, I think, of like where the tripping points, where people might stumble is in this process. I didn't go through all of the, like, you know, to the point of publishing the type definitions. That's really, it is just a small detail of the package JSON points to the output file. The build system manages the actual creation of those .d, .ts files, so you don't really have to think about that too much. But yeah, I think, you know, this might be something I want to do again. You know, I didn't actually do much of the converting that package, but I think it was a good demonstration of the starting point of adding types for a package. Cool. All right. Thank you everybody for joining. I will go ahead and I guess I can.
Thank you, Andrew.
I don't know what I'm doing here.